Well, hello there. So, if you are finding us on YouTube, this and have never seen this before, you have found the Beyond Belief Sobriety podcast. And my name is John, and I'm the host of this podcast. And what we do here is we explore topics of interest to people who have found or who are seeking a secular path to recovery from addictions of all kinds. And what we do is we post videos here on YouTube, and we also have an audio podcast that you can find anywhere you like to download your podcast. And today I have a guest I'm really looking forward to speaking with because he wrote a really cool book. It's a memoir called Another in the Fire, and his name is Aaron Reed. And Aaron has a really interesting story, at least from my perspective, not being familiar with the world that he lived in. I learned a lot from this book, and he had some really poignant mentions of addiction throughout the book that I picked up on that I thought were that I don't know, just kind of stuck with me. So it's a book that I would recommend for anybody who's interested in learning about just reading something to relate to with addiction and to hear a story. I mean, if you could come out of this story, then I think you can come out of almost anything. So, Aaron, thank you so much for being here. It's nice to have you. Welcome to Beyond Belief Sobriety.
Thank you, John. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for your time and your interest.
Well, I really enjoyed the book. It's nice to read something that's so well read. I have to tell you, I'm not a very good writer. I've been told I was a good writer when I was in high school, but my skills never improved beyond that. So when I read something that is written so well, it just blows me away. That how do you do that? I mean, every paragraph was just so well thought out and planned. It just seemed, and it just flowed so nicely. I just really enjoyed it. But I thought what we would do, if you don't mind, is just kind of go through your story through the book. And I do have some questions and some things that I noticed as I was reading it that I'll probably ask you. But just in short, your story begins. First of all, you start the book with an arrest that happens in an airport in Colombia, and it was a pretty intense situation. There was a dog there that smelled something on you, and they pulled you away and hustled you off to prison eventually.
That's right.
But then you go back to the beginning, and the story really started in San Francisco. And at that time, you were working as a missionary at a church, and you met someone, and you got married. And it seemed to me that at that point, you just had a normal life. And my question because your life went totally not normal, not too far after that, but what was there anything before we met you in San Francisco that would have indicated that you might have an addiction problem later on in life?
Sure, that's a good question. To answer that, we would have to go back to my university days. I went to school and got a BA in written communication from Eastern Michigan University way back in the day. So we're going back 30 years. And I was a recreational drug user at university, and that was the social circle that I remained in throughout my university days. Recreational drugs were plentiful. And so it was the norm.
Sure.
So I didn't run into any severe addictions back then. It was like I said, it was recreational, but that might have indicated the problems that I later on experienced in life.
Okay. And so what happens then is you're in San Francisco. You meet someone, you fall in love, you get married, you become a missionary at this church, and you take a trip to India. And then after this, you decide that you're going to get a job in Cambodia. And I was wondering, was there something about that visit to India that put in your mind this idea that you wanted to go work abroad? Or was that something that was already in your brain? I think you mentioned that you weren't really happy with American culture anyway.
Sure. Sure. My international exposure happened at a very young age. When I was at university, my parents were working as international educators, and they went to Singapore.
Oh,
They went to Singapore in 1990, I think it was, and they stayed there for 6 years. They were teaching in the international community, and they would fly me over for the summers. And so I spent summers in Singapore and just the general geographic area there in Asia. And that was my first real exposure to the international community.
I see. Okay, so that's what had in your mind to do this, to move over to Cambodia, and you went to work at a school teaching over there.
Sure. Yeah. And previous to that, I had also taught in Japan as an
Oh,
international
okay.
educator. So I had travel in my blood.
I
And
see.
I've always had a real fascination and lust for travel and
Okay.
international experience.
Okay. And so when you moved to there, and you went to Cambodia shortly after you got married?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And she quickly became dissatisfied. She wasn't real happy. I don't know if it was that quickly. Maybe it was a couple years that she started feeling like she was impatient with what was going on in Cambodia.
Yeah, when you relocate yourself to a brand new culture and a brand new country, there's a lot of adjustments, of course, that need to be made, and a lot of new experiences, and some of those will always be difficult. It takes a lot of acclimation to finally get the rhythm of a new life in a new country. And when we moved to Cambodia, I had already garnered an intense fascination with that culture. And so when I got hired to teach in the international school there, I dove in headfirst. And I was very happy and very pleased. But I was also supported by um, English speaking people. Having worked in the international school, everyone spoke English. And so my transition into that culture was very easy.
Gotcha.
The transition for my wife was not so easy.
Mm, hmm.
And so she was struggling a little bit, and she 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 eventually missed her family, is what
Right.
it came down to. Her family was back in San Francisco. I would teach throughout the year, and then in the summers we would journey back to San Francisco to reconnect with family and friends. But it proved to be a pretty difficult transition for my wife at the time.
Hmm. And when you first were over there and you were teaching at this school, you were doing well, and it seemed like life again was normal.
Hmm.
You were doing well in your job, and you seemed to enjoy it. And am I right that at some point a friend, this is how I kind of remember it, you met a friend, and it was like somebody that was more like someone who you could party with, but you had this idea in your head for some reason after meeting him that you wanted to smoke pot. You wanted to go get some pot.
Right, right,
What was that? Why
right.
was that? Why'd that suddenly come into your head to do that?
That was I had just come back from the States, and I
Okay.
was there alone, and my wife had remained to spend more time in the States with the family. So I had
Gotcha.
journeyed back to Cambodia, to Phnom Penh, by myself, and I was jet lagged, and it was in the middle of the night, and I was all wired and everything, and I thought, oh, a little come down I could
Right.
use a little come down
And
right
you
now.
remember that from your college days. And it was like,
Sure.
yeah, okay.
So, and I hadn't smoked pot in years, many years.
Right.
And so sitting there in the house, and I'm all agitated and wired up because I'm jet lagged. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to go out and get some weed. And so I walked across Hun Sen Park, near the park where we lived. And I went into the ghetto where I knew where the ghetto was. And I thought, yeah, I can go over there and score some pot. So I went over there, and being 3 a.m. or whatever it was, the place is in full swing. You've got
Okay.
you've got drug dealers everywhere, you've got pimps, you've got the prostitutes doing their thing. Everyone's hustling on the street.
Uh-huh.
So I spied a little group of people over there that I thought could be somewhat approachable. So I went over, and there's a very serious language barrier going on. So I went up and asked for some pot, and the guys are looking at me like, "What are you talking about?" And so I pantomimed smoking a pipe,
Right.
right? And so then, they get the message. So one guy reaches into his pocket and he gives me a little baggie. I give him the money and off I go. So I go back to the house and I'm ready to smoke my pot, and I open the baggie and a bunch of ice crystals fall out. And I had never smoked ice before. And I at the time I wasn't even sure what it was. I didn't know what the substance was. So I was so bent on getting high that I didn't really care. I'm like, okay, we'll see what this does. So I put the crystals in the pipe and lit up, and bam, that was
Is
it.
is ice methamphetamine? Is that what it is?
That's right.
Okay. Okay. And yeah, what a decision. And who would have thought? Who would have
Mm,
thought? Because that
mm,
really put you on a whole trajectory of addiction and got you to eventually speaking with me on this podcast eventually.
absolutely. Yeah. And I remember, I don't know if it's like this for everybody, but that first hit, and I was gone. There
Yeah.
was there was no looking back. And I finished that, my portion that I had just purchased. I finished it, and right when it was finished, bam, I was right back out on the street looking for the next one.
Yeah, and it seemed as I was reading the book, it's like that was almost a constant thing. I mean, constant you would be smoking like all the time. It seemed just part of just to keep you going, and you would be up for like long periods of time. Is that right? Is it like yeah, I mean days you without sleep? Um,
Days. And
Amazing.
yeah, it at least for myself, I'm not sure. I can't speak for
Yeah.
other people who had experiences with this type of drug. But for me, um, I smoked until I literally collapsed. And
Mhm.
sometimes that would be, for prolonged periods lasting up to 3, 4, 5 days.
Yeah. Wow. So you so you did that, and then what I found what was really interesting to me to learn about was the culture around these bars and the women in the bars. And so you went to a bar and there was a woman there that was especially beautiful you were attracted to that you ended up having a relationship with. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about about that, if you can tell that story about meeting her and that relationship and that part of your story.
Okay. Um, the nightlife scene in Phnom Penh centers around prostitution.
Uh-huh.
It's a very sad existence for the women there in that country. Being a developing country, effective education is not offered to the widespread population. And so what happens then is the young women that are raised in Phnom Penh, they they get older and they're lacking a formal education of any sort. And so what ends up happening is they end up having to choose between prostitution, to support their children or their families, um, or working in the garment industry, which is the euphemism for sweatshops.
Right.
And
Right.
so, given that choice, those women are between a rock and a hard place. And so, every time you go out in Phnom Penh, at least every time I went out with my friends, that's where we would end up. We would end up down in the red light districts, drinking beers and doing whatever, hanging out. And yeah, the prostitution scene there is widespread, unavoidable. And
Right.
so, they call them taxi girls, and the taxi girls work in the bars, and they are employed there to pour drinks. They're employed there to light cigarettes for the customers, and they're employed there to pretty much push themselves to the limits of what they are willing or not willing to do.
Okay.
And everything is money. It's money driven. And so I was out in the bar that night and I met that woman. And that was, but by that time in my story, John, I had taken on numerous bad choices. I was smoking ice on a regular basis, And then meeting her and beginning the affair with her was another fatal choice that ended up with the death of my marriage.
It almost seemed to me too, because it almost seemed to me that these relationships, especially the third one, but it seemed to me like these relationships were almost an addiction onto themselves, because it was like they weren't always good for you, but they weren't, you couldn't stop, it seemed. Did you think, do you think of them in terms like that? It seems like they ran parallel with the story with your addiction to ice.
Yes, that's a really good observation. Consciously or unconsciously, there's an argument there.
Yeah.
There could have been. I had a very back in those days, John. I had a very minimal capacity to be alone,
Yeah.
and I had this need and this desire to be with company.
Right.
Whether it was a sexual relationship or a monogamous relationship, I needed to be around people. And
Right.
so the idea of going home and getting high by myself, it just didn't work. And so I constantly was getting high and then going out and carousing and looking for more action and more stimulation.
Right. And there were, and I guess most of these women, were they mostly into drugs too?
The first one was not. But all of the other ones that came
Were.
after her were absolutely in the scene.
Right. And it was really interesting, that the whole dynamic, where, like, you, as you just described, I mean, the poverty and having to go to work, and the women got, it was almost like they were hardened, right? They almost got like, it seemed like to me that they were very, um they knew what they needed. They needed money to take care of their family, I guess. And it was kind of a transactional, relationship in a lot of ways.
Yes, and that's the women that end up working in the sex industry end up being quite annihilated emotionally. When a woman chooses to enter into that type of profession, um, in the end result is that they have to unlearn how to love.
Right.
And I think I wrote that. I
Yeah.
used different phraseology in the book when I described that, but the term Srey Kuat, it's a Khmer term that means broken girl. And so prostitutes are often referred to as Srey Kuaks.
Okay.
They're broken girls. They have, in order to survive, I think it's a survival mechanism for them. They need to unlearn how to love, and it's quite tragic.
Yeah. So, can you tell the story now? Because I can't remember when you actually started getting into the drug business itself. I can't
Mhm.
remember if it was when you were, with, Thea, or if it was after that. Can you kind of just tell the story about how did you get involved with selling drugs?
Mhm. So, as an addict, I'm sure some of our listeners will be able to relate to this. When you're using and you've garnered a habit, a serious habit, and you are doing daily ingestion of
Yeah.
whatever drug you choose, you quickly figure out that if you sell, if you become a seller, a dealer, you suddenly have this magic mound of free substances. And so in the early days when I was using, I quickly took inventory of my finances and noticed that, wow, the money is really going out
Hmm.
here
Hmm.
in a serious way. How can I balance that? And yeah, I quickly learned that if I become a dealer, then basically I'm smoking for free.
Right.
And so that's how the dealing part came in. And then when I started getting into the smuggling aspect, there's a portion of the book where I wrote I was sitting in a room one evening with a friend of mine who was a heroin addict, and he was doing his stuff and I was doing mine, and there was a knock on the door, and we opened the door, and a longtime friend of my friends entered the room, And um, the friend that I was with at the time and the man that entered the room, they hadn't seen each other for a while. And so it was like this reunion of sorts. And they were like, "Hey, how's it going? How have you been? I've missed you, haven't seen you. So good to see you. Thanks for coming by." And the friend entered the room and gifted my friend a packet of heroin that he had just smuggled back from, I think it was Thailand or Myanmar. And, it was this great gift giving um, procedure that went on. And my friend that was using heroin at the time immediately opened the package and tested out the product, which left me sitting there in the room with his friend. And so I started, he was a very colorful figure. So I started inquiring about, what are you up to? What are you into? Where'd you get this stuff? And so he went into his stories about his smuggling and becoming a mule, working for a Nigerian cartel. And so we visited that evening. And on his way out, he turned to me and he said, "Hey, do you know anybody who wants to fly?" uh, that's an invitation to start, get into the smuggling business. And my ears perked up, and I immediately answered without thinking, I'm interested in flying. I
Right.
think I think I'd be really good at that type of thing.
Yeah.
And so, thus, I was quickly recruited into the cartel that he was working for, and that's how I made the connections with the Nigerian cartel, and that's how I got into the business of muling.
Yeah, and your first experience really wasn't a good one. The one that when you had to go to Brazil.
Hmm.
You want to talk
Yeah.
about that?
Sure. Yeah, that was a nightmare. Well, the cartels do a very good job in convincing you that everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
That's their job, you know.
And you were new to this, and so you weren't really questioning anything that this guy was telling you in the beginning, right?
I
He's
was
telling you
not.
everything's gonna be okay. You don't worry about it. And you say, okay.
Right. And so and I'm going along with it, and there's a component that we need to look at closely at this point. Um, my drug use had become so intense that I my concern and care for myself and my concern and care for others had already started deteriorating. And so I went into the muling gig um, kind of with a very dangerous sense of apathy. And so, I would meet with my jefe, my boss, and he would be laying out the blueprints of the job. You're going to be going here, you're going to be staying here for this long. On such a day, you're going to meet an associate of ours, and they will give you the package, and you'll bring it back to South Asia. That's it. That's the job. And they do a very good job convincing you that you're going to be taken care of. Everything's going to go fine. You don't have to worry. And then, of course, you get over there on the other side of the world, and you're by yourself, and you have no product. And all of a sudden, you find yourself in a dingy hotel room and you've run out of money. And so you place the call to your jefe, your boss, and you send the email and you're asking for funds. Hey, I'm out of money here, and the pickup isn't going to happen for another week. Send me the cash. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. And so, and it was a real fragile existence at that point. Um, and it was dangerous, but like I said, I had at that point I was plagued with such intense apathy that I was willing to just roll with it,
Yeah, you use that
no
word a
matter
few
how.
times in the book, apathy. That's a really good description of I think what happens to us when we get into addiction. We just get to this point where, um, especially when we're using like that, where it's just like I don't care. This is what I do. This
Hmm.
is this is you know.
Hmm.
I know I was that way, and I think it's a really good description. It's just of just kind of resigning yourself to the fact that this is my life. This is what I
Hmm.
do, and you know. So
It's a very
yeah,
dangerous place when you get to that point of not caring about yourself
yeah,
and not caring about your friends who have been with you your entire life, and then all of a sudden the relationships start deteriorating. And in that face of deterioration, you don't even care.
Right.
Very dangerous place.
Right. So, so anyway, that doesn't go down very well. You end up having to sleep at an airport, and you have to borrow money from some people, and you get back, and the boss, I guess, was unhappy that things didn't go down well, but you did kind of stand up for yourself, and you told him that he let you down,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
I don't know that kind of, I mean, that I mean, it seemed like that took a lot of guts to come out like that with the a Nigerian cartel, or but is that maybe that's just part of the apathy? It's like, you know,
Yeah, I'm going to let it fly. Yeah, there was. I did have, just despite being mistreated on the runs that they would send me on, I did enjoy somewhat of a comfortable relationship with my boss,
yeah,
with the guy that was sending me on these runs, and we would speak candidly. And
yeah,
but yeah, that time when I came back from the botched trip to Brazil, to Sao Paulo, um, yeah, I really did let it fly, and I think it was a combination of frustration and apathy.
right, okay,
That here I had been sent on the other side of the world. It was a complete debacle, and I came back empty-handed. I didn't come back to the payday that I was expecting. I returned and went straight back into this desperate um, existence of living in poverty and
yeah.
and dealing so I can stay high, and nothing had changed.
And I forgot to mention, by this time you're not even working at the school anymore. You lost that job at the school because you weren't engaged with the students and doing what you're supposed to do. And the headmaster got these reports about not doing what you're supposed to do. So you lost
That's
that
right.
job, and you were really existing. This was your income, was
Right.
selling and running drugs. So this guy, he wants to give you some easier assignments. So he sends you to Thailand, I think, to open up bank accounts.
Oh, well, he sent me to Thailand, carrying a small load of drugs to deliver,
Okay.
and then I returned, and yeah, I was just kind of sitting around Phnom Penh waiting for the next gig, and he called me and he said, "I want to meet." So we met, and he said, "I think I've got another gig that I want you to do for us, and it doesn't involve drugs." And so my ears pricked up. I said, "Okay, well, it sounds like a little bit more s- safer, more safe of a job than muling internationally." So I inquired about it, and he said, "Here's what we do." It was a money laundering gig, and they apparently had clients around the world that wanted to um, shelter money in bank accounts in Saigon, in Ho Chi Minh City,
Oh, okay.
which is just it's a six hour bus ride from Phnom Penh. And he said, what we want you to do is very simple. We will have passports made for you, authentic passports, and you will take those passports and you will go and open bank accounts in Saigon, and that's all you have to do. That's it. And so I said, "Oh, that sounds pretty easy." And so got on the bus, went to Saigon, and opened up a string of bank accounts. So
And then there's going to be a deposit, but you wouldn't know how much that deposit would be, so you didn't know if you were going to get paid. And it
right,
turns out that you weren't getting paid.
right.
And then later, I can't remember how this happened, but you ended up saying enough is enough, and you there was like a $12,000 deposit or something, and you kept it all, right?
I did. At that point, I had been working for that particular cartel for well over a year, doing their bidding and eking out my existence and trying to keep myself high and trying to keep myself fed and trying to keep them happy. And I had gone on so many jobs and had found myself completely left alone and destitute. And so by that time, I'd had enough. And yeah, I was at my wit's end with the people I was working for. And so they called me one day and said, "Hey, there's good news. A deposit's finally come into one of the accounts. We need you to go pick it up." And I said, great. Let's do it. So I got on the bus and went back to Saigon and made the withdrawal. And then coming back to Phnom Penh, I was at the Vietnamese Cambodian border where I sent a text to my boss saying, I have no intention of bringing you any of this money. You know, after being left on my own and countless times on the other side of the world with no support, no finances, hungry. I'm keeping this money to pay myself for all of those situations that you put me in over the past year and a half.
Hmm. And then what was kind of interesting about that boss, it turns out that you were right, and the cartel kind of demoted that guy, but sent him somewhere else, right? So
Yes,
it
that's
was like
right.
you didn't have any repercussions from the Nigerian. They didn't come down on you about that. They pretty much kind of, if I read this right, they said, okay, I think you're right. The guy is just incompetent, so they moved him off, and another guy came in who was more competent.
That's exactly
Yeah.
what happened. Yep.
But before you started working for him, though, there was I can't, I might get the sequence wrong here, but there was a really interesting situation where the guy that you were originally selling drugs for, um, he okay, you knew all these different people, but you knew this one guy. I can't remember his name, but he had really great product. And this general character who you were selling drugs for found out that what a great thing it was, and he wanted, like, I can't remember, 100,000. He wanted a large amount of drugs from this guy, and this guy didn't want to sell to him because he wouldn't sell to Khmer, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so this is really a weird situation, and you had other people warn you about this one character. I think anyway, not to get involved, but you thought he was okay. So can you tell that story? Because it was just a. This is really pretty high stakes stuff here. What happened? If you could just kind of go through that story, and I think this is before you went over to South America for that for the second time, right?
That's right.
Okay, yeah. So if you
That's
could just
right.
kind of share about that story.
Okay. At one point, when you're in that world and your daily existence depends on buying and selling and using on a constant basis, you meet a lot of colorful characters.
Yeah.
And so I met this one guy. Um, he was also a dealer in the scene in the city there, and he had heard about my stunt with the Nigerians, um, paying myself from the deposit that had come in, and so he got my phone number and he called me out of the blue one day and he said he wanted to meet, and so it's another dealer in the city, so I'll go and give him some FaceTime. So I met with him and. He it was a recruiting meeting. He at the end of the meeting he said, I can beat whatever price you're paying now with whatever you want. So that means more product in my pocket. So I started deriving product from him, and I was also deriving product from um, another Khmer at the time. So I was drawing product from two different guys, and so I ended up meeting shortly thereafter with my Khmer friend who sampled the product that I was getting from the guy from Belgium. And he thought it was great. And it was great. It was supercharged. It was very strong, good product. And he thought it was great. And he said, I would like to buy a large quantity of this from you. And so I then started functioning as a middleman,
Right.
trying to create this deal where I would get these two guys together in the
And you
same
take a
room
cut.
and I would take a cut of it. And so we set up the meeting, and we sat down in my Khmer friend's little house there, and it was my Khmer friend, my acquaintance from Belgium, and myself. And the deal started to go down, and the guy from Belgium threw out a very large package on the floor for my Khmer friend to taste and sample and purchase. And so we all sampled the product. And when it came time um, for my Khmer friend to pay for the product, he it happened so quickly. In the same moment that he stood up, he reached down and swiped up the product and disappeared into his bedroom and shut the door.
Wow.
And myself and my friend from Belgium were sitting there. We were waiting for a couple of minutes, and my friend said, "What's up? Where's your friend?" And I said, "Oh, he's just getting ready. We're gonna go into town and get some finances to pay you." And so 2 minutes go by, 4 minutes go by, 5 minutes go by, and the tension is starting to rise in the room. And finally, we realized that the guy had taken off. He had jumped out of his bedroom window and was gone with the product, and left me there as the middleman with
Right.
with the seller. And so that created an enormous tense relationship that lasted many, many months, where my friend from Belgium was holding me accountable
Right.
for the loss of the product. And he even created this fantasy that I had staged the whole thing, and that I
Right.
was working in tandem with my Khmer friend, and he had ran off, and then days later he and I had gotten together and split the product or whatever. And that was my Belgian friend's perspective of what had gone down. And so he was holding me accountable for the loss of the product and the loss of non-payment. And so a couple, this went on for many months, and then finally one Sunday morning, I remember it well. Um, Myself and my girlfriend at the time were just enjoying a lazy Sunday morning. There was incense burning in the house. It was very quiet. It was a beautiful day, and we heard a knock on the door. And my girlfriend went and opened the door without even looking to see who it was. And in walks this guy that I had never seen before. And he had this real sick and twisted look on his face. And he just walked into my front room there in the living room, and he's just staring at me. And it was very uncomfortable. So I said, "Who are you? What do you want?" And he said, "You're Aaron, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah, who the hell are you?" And he said, "Well," and he introduced himself, and he said, I'm an associate of your friend, and I'm going to call him now. He's been wanting to speak with you about some business deals that went south." And so he called, and he placed a one ring call that signaled my friend down on the street to come up, and he came in, and they subsequently you know took a pound of flesh from
Right.
me, as payment, I guess, for what they thought they deserved. And yeah, ended up causing permanent damage to my finger. I don't know if you can
Yeah.
see this.
Oh, I do.
Yeah, this is a trigger finger. So in the process of getting beat up, they spiked my knuckle here with a nail. And so it's interesting. Just on a side note, um, since that happened, many people have observed this little handicap that I have on my hand, and people have asked me, why don't you go and get that fixed? You can have reconstructive surgery on that finger. And I came to the decision that I don't think I'm ever going to get this fixed, because it's a reminder for me. Every time I look at it, it's a reminder of where I ended up,
Yeah.
and the damage, the literal damage that it caused my body,
Oh,
all the
yeah.
poor choices that I made. So yeah, this is my permanent trigger finger here.
So, what your story is similar to other people that I know who went to prison in that it saved your life ultimately.
Ultimately, it saved my life.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that you would have died a long time ago if you would have continued on the track you were. And I think you would have. I mean, it was just I mean, yeah, you're when you read this book, you'll understand just how serious your use was, how dangerous the job was, the situations that you were getting into. Even your girlfriend was pretty violent,
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it was just so. Anyway, so let's talk about the prison. So and what happens now? And now we go back to the beginning of the book. You're in the
Hmm.
airport. You've got drugs on you. You think that they're well packed. The dogs won't smell them, but the dog picked up on the smell, right?
That's right.
And you get busted.
Right.
and then you go to this prison. And I wonder, because not there wasn't a lot of detail involved about what happened in the prison, but a couple of things that I picked up on. First of all, you did get involved with this church group within the prison, and there were a group of people there that served as a community that supported you,
That's right.
and that made a big difference. And I just wonder, this is where I just need you to kind of fill in all the details about what happened, your experience in that prison, and the transformation that occurred while you were there. If you can talk
Hmm.
about that.
Sure. Um, as an expat who has been living in South Asia for, I don't know, about 8 or 9 years at that point, to suddenly wake up one day and find yourself walking into a Colombian prison.
Yeah.
I described it in the book. It wasn't culture shock, it was culture electrocution.
Yeah.
I had no Spanish speaking abilities whatsoever. Um, and so, yeah, and I walked into the prison, and that first 6 months was just stunning. Um, it's hard to describe. A lot of adjustments, a lot of quickly learning how to survive in that type of an environment. And you premised this conversation, John, by mentioning that prison had saved my life, and it indeed did that, because that is where I uh, eventually became sober,
Yeah.
right? And I
And
don't.
by the way, that's not easy to do there because there were drugs flying all over the place in that prison.
Yeah, there was a lot of drugs coming in. And I can't claim to have any magic recipe for recovery. I wish I did. I think each person's path to a successful recovery is going to be tailored to that specific individual.
I think
Uh,
so.
what works for this guy doesn't necessarily work for this guy.
Right.
And so, what worked for me was um, making the decision, number one. And the decision was enormously difficult to make because you've been living with this addiction. It's like an unwanted companion of sorts. And you've been living with this unwanted companion for years, and you don't want to let it go. It's part of you, it's an essential part of you in your existence. And to actually come to make the decision is an extremely difficult thing to do. Um, in some cases, I think making the decision for sobriety um, is more difficult than actually kicking the drug. And for me, that rang true. So making the decision in prison to finally pursue sobriety was the first step. And then the very next thing that I found was essential for my recovery was environmental control. Yes, there were mountains of cocaine in that prison, and acres of weed, and I found that um, surrounding myself with sober individuals who had never participated in the addiction lifestyle was a real safe haven for me. And so I quickly, once the decision to pursue sobriety was made, I quickly um, threw myself into a very intimate social circle of people who had never experienced that life of addiction, who
Oh,
knew nothing about it, who had no influences of that kind whatsoever. And had I brought my addiction into that circle, I certainly would have been shunned.
oh,
You
wow.
know, they would have
Okay,
been like,
interesting.
so it was a very positive move on my part to make the decision, and then to also quickly control my environment so that the people that I was keeping company with, um, when you're keeping company with a certain social group, there's certain expectations involved, and if you bring in something foreign to that group that they have no relationship with, it's going to cause trouble.
Right.
And so I knew that if I was going to do it successfully, that I needed to stay within this new social circle and derive off of their sober living and their influences. And so that really worked for me, John. Controlling the environment and who I kept company with in the jail.
It also seems like that when you were in the prison, as harsh as that was, and as dangerous as that was, and as bad as people there were in there were also some people there that seemed to care about you. It seems like that was the one place where it seemed like you had a relationship that was, I don't know, positive and good for you. You know,
Very positive. Yeah, very positive.
like you weren't getting outside, and it's ironic that you would get it in a place like that, but that's where you did, it seemed to me. I mean the relationships that you had, the most fascinating part about this book, I thought, was the relationships you had with people, all kinds of different people, and that was, it's just so, it was so so interesting. It's even hard to describe, but especially some of your relationships with these women. But most of those relationships weren't ultimately, didn't seem to be very healthy or good for you. You were trapped in your addiction. Most of those people that you had relationships with were in the addiction cycle with you. But then when you were in the prison, boy, you had to navigate all this rough crowd, and you found a good group of people that actually cared about you and who were also, I guess, interested in change and improving themselves.
That's right. That's right. And whatever crimes that they had committed that had led them to that same place that I found myself
Yeah.
in. Um, you're absolutely right. It was a really sincere group of guys there, and it wasn't a large group. It was very
Uh
intimate.
huh.
It was me and three other guys,
Uh huh.
and yeah, I ended up spending every waking moment with those guys, and taking whatever influence I could from them, and then thus reciprocating as well,
Right.
offering a friendship back to them, in the best capacity that I was able to.
You got out after 3 years. Is that right?
3 years, 2 months, 21 days.
Okay. And what was the reentry like, leaving that prison, and I guess, did you come back to the United States?
Mm. I after a long legal battle, I was finally released on parole in October of 2018. And what that meant is that it was a conditional release. So because I was a foreigner in a foreign country, um, I was a flight risk, absolutely. And,
Oh.
and so they did not exonerate me from my sentence, but rather released me from the jail with the condition that I serve the remainder of my sentence in Bogota. And so it's kind of ironic. I came out of the jail relieved, obviously, restored, um, and sturdy in my sobriety. And it was ironic in that when you picture people coming out of prison, you picture their families waiting out on the street, and
Right,
you
right.
know the children are jumping up and down, and someone has flowers, and I came out and there was none of that. My family was back in the States,
Right.
and whatever friends I had left were back in the States, and yeah, I walked out of the jail completely and utterly alone, with literally my all of my belongings slung over my shoulder in a trash bag. And I eventually rented a room in a little condominium, and I had no connections in Bogota, no family, no friends, and it ironically ended up being an incredible environment for me to be in, to write the book.
Oh.
I
Did you
had
started writing it then?
immediately,
Wow.
immediately when I walked out. I had written. The writing process of this book was very simple. There was very little creative effort involved. Um, After my escapades in South Asia and going to jail, I had amassed a large stack of emails and text messages from my phone that had spanned all of my movements while I was in the life back in South Asia. and I had passport stamps. I had so many passport stamps, they had to sew new pages into my passport. So everything, all my experiences were incredibly time dated. And so I amassed all of that, all of those resources, and I literally laid it all out on the table and created a linear timeline of everything that had happened and occurred. And so that allowed me to write the book pretty effortlessly. If I got hung up, I would just refer back to the passport to see, oh yeah, I was there on this date, and this is what I was doing. And so, yeah, there was little creative effort in the actual writing process. It was all laid out for me.
Did you write it as sort of therapy? Was it a therapeutic experience, or you wanted to help people through your story? What was the
Hmm.
motivation?
That's a really good question, John. My it was a very as easy as it was to write the book, or at least the first draft.
Hmm.
It was also very painful. I remember sitting in that little room in that condo many nights, and I would get to portions of the book that involved me reflecting back onto the complete and utterly revolting person that I had been.
Hmm. Yeah, and you talk about that in the book too, by the way. You talk
Yeah,
about yourself and how and decisions you made. But anyway, go ahead.
yeah, and so I guess there was a catharsis involved in the writing process, in that in order to portray the story in an honest and truthful way, I needed to go back and relive many of the horrible things that I had done.
Right.
And it was a good, long, hard look in the mirror. And then having to transpose that onto the printed page was painful. And I remember crying some nights, just out of total embarrassment, like looking back and thinking, my God, how could I have done that? How could I have said those things to that person? How could I have treated that person that way? And there was a healing process involved in the writing process.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write it to confront myself and all of the poor decisions that I had made over the years. And I also wanted to write it with the aim of sharing my story with other people that may be trapped uh, in circumstances that they would rather heal from and get out of. Um, yeah, I hope my hope and prayer with this book is that it falls into the hands of addicts or loved ones that have have addicts in their family or in their social circles that are really struggling with addiction, and hopefully they can read my book and identify with some of the characters in it, identify with some of the struggles that people wrestling with addiction experience, and hopefully and ultimately find some sort of healing, some sort of glimmer of hope that they can cling on to take steps to a more healthy type of living.
Well, I hope that you write again. It'll be interesting to see, as the years go on into your recovery, how your life evolves from this. And you're such a good writer. I'd love to see you down the road at some time write again, because your story is going to continue on, and you're going to continue to grow, and what you take from this experience is going to evolve and change. Your understanding of it will evolve and change too. So it's that's the part about recovery that's so rich. The last thing I want to ask you before we leave is, I'm just kind of curious, have you stayed in touch with those people in Cambodia? Is there anybody there that you've stayed in touch with, or was it kind of a clean break after you went to prison?
Wow, that's another really good question with an interesting answer. Um, Everyone, all of the characters that appear in this story and in my story, all the characters that I was interacting with and doing business with and doing drugs with, um, and carousing with, every single character that appears in the book is now either dead
Oh
or
my God.
in prison.
Oh wow.
And so, and that's an interesting fact when you look at the lifestyle of addiction. um, you don't have many cards to choose from. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, you, you, in my case and in my story, everyone is either dead or serving long time jail sentences in South Asia.
Oh wow. How sad. How
It's
sad.
it's very sad, and it just goes to show the severity of that lifestyle.
Yeah.
If you embark on that type of journey, um, you're either going to end up in prison, or you'll end up dead, or you'll end up in recovery.
Yep. As you
And
did.
as I did, and I, I don't know, you can call it what you want, God or a higher power or whatever, but um, fate landed me in a pretty good place.
Yeah.
In a pretty awful place. Prison is an awful place, but it ended up being where I needed to end up in
Yeah.
order to turn things around.
Well, thank you again for agreeing to come on, and thank you for writing that book. It was such a pleasure to read it. And books like that, memoirs, you can take so much from those. I mean, this is one of those books that I'll be thinking about a month from now, and something will click with me in my brain about that. Boy, I wish I would have asked him about that. But it's just a really really cool book. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for appearing here with me here on Beyond Belief Variety. I appreciate it.
John, I really had a good time talking with you today.
Yeah, it
And
was fun.
yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to share my story.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for the work you're doing.